Welcome everyone to the Community IT Innovators webinar on Google Workspace for nonprofits. It used to be pretty rare that we saw growing or mid-sized nonprofits using Google Workspace at the organizational level, but it's growing more and more common. And so today we'd like to share some insights with you on how you can use it, especially how to use the shared drive feature, which is a little new and a little tricky, but very useful. So our learning objectives this session are that after the session, you should be able to describe Google Workspace and its tools and identify advantages to nonprofits using Google Workspace, describe the different approaches of Google Workspace and Office 365 as nonprofit IT platforms and some of the pros and cons of each. We won't have time to get into all of the pros and cons, but we'll touch on some of the main ones. And understand Google shared drives for nonprofits and how they are different from Google Drive. So please stay to the end and take the survey after the webinar, which helps us improve. And one person drawn at random will win a $25 gift certificate. So if that's an incentive. I want to remind everyone today that Community IT is vendor agnostic. So this presentation is to discuss how nonprofits are using these tools and what we are observing about them. But we aren't recommending any platform in general. We only make recommendations to our clients based on specific business needs and nonprofit culture. So we encourage you to submit questions and comments through the chat today. We probably won't be able to get to everything, but you can always contact us after the webinar for follow-up. And our presenter, Steve, has also written a couple of articles on Google Workspace that you can find on our website, and I will post those links in the chat in a minute if you haven't seen them yet. This webinar is being recorded, and I'll post the video, podcast, and transcript on our site within a week, so don't worry too much about taking notes. My name is Carolyn Woodard. I'm Marketing Director at Community IT, and I'll be monitoring the Q&A in the chat and helping Steve with his presentation today. And I've already learned a lot about Google Workspace and shared drive, so I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. So Steve, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Steve Longenecker. I'm the Director of IT Consulting at Community IT. I've been at Community IT for almost 18 years. Just last weekend, my son graduated from high school, and when I was hired at Community IT, I asked if I could possibly start a week or two later than we were planning on, because he had just been born and I wanted to spend a little bit more time at home with him. So that's how I remember how long I've been at Community IT. I'm pleased to be with you today and share with you about Google Workspace.
That's great. I do remember that. I remember that. So before we begin, if you're not familiar with Community IT, a little bit about us. We are a 100% employee-owned managed services provider, and we provide outsourced IT support. We work exclusively with nonprofit organizations, and our mission is to help nonprofits accomplish their missions through the effective use of technology. We serve nonprofits across the United States, and we've been doing this for over 20 years. We are technology experts and are consistently given an MSP 501 recognition for being a top MSP, which is an honor that we received again in 2021. So now we are going to do a little interaction to get things going. In the pre-webinar questions, a lot of you indicated that you're already using Google Workspace. So I'm going to launch a poll. There we go. In the poll, you will be asked if you use your nonprofit uses Google all the time, if you are thinking of changing to Google Workspace, if you started with Google but left it for another platform, if you use a hybrid, you use Google for some things, Office 365 or something else for other things, or if this entire question is not applicable and you're here in the webinar for some other reason. So Steve, would you like to tell us what people responded to?
Sure, so I have to look at my other screen for that, so everyone who sees my face will see me looking away. So 15% said that they're on all Google all the time nonprofit. Another 15% said they're thinking of changing to Google Workspace. Just a very few, just one of the participants, 3%, said that they would started with Google but left it for another platform. And then over half, 63%, said that they use a hybrid, Google for some things, Office 365 for others, best of breed, whatever. And then 5% said it's not an applicable question to them.
Excellent. So that's kind of a whopping group of our attendees who are using it as a hybrid. So we'll
Yeah,
talk
it's
a little bit
interesting.
more about that later. Yeah. And stay tuned because our webinar next month is all about that. So to start out, we're going to do some definitions. So Steve, what is Google Workspace and what tools does that include?
So it's a suite of services. They're often described as your basic productivity suite of services. This is Microsoft 365 is the other major player in that field. We can see here on this slide that there's a lot of classic tools that people are familiar with. Gmail is the first and foremost of that. Calendar apps are a calendar app. Document editing and document storage, which is Drive, Forms, a meeting space comparable to Zoom, comparable to Microsoft Teams, and a bit more than that. We also have on this slide analytics, Google Analytics, and Google and YouTube, which is a company owned by Alphabet, the owner of Google. It used to be Google, and now the corporate is called Alphabet. They aren't part of Google Workspace, but we threw them up here just because certainly any nonprofit that is doing anything with the web would want to have be using analytics to find out how their web traffic is doing. And then YouTube, of course, everyone's familiar with that. And there's a lot of YouTube opportunities for nonprofits that you should explore separate from Google Workspace. But since it's owned by Google, I just threw their little icons on this slide. So that's what Google Workspace is. It's a suite of services. They're cloud services, and you use them to do sort of the basics, the things that sort of keep the lifeblood of your organization in terms of IT. There's other stuff that you do, but email, calendaring, document sharing, that stuff is like everyday operational work, and that's what Google Workspace does for you.
So I know that we have some clients and maybe some folks in our network and community, maybe some people on this webinar who are skeptical of Google Workspace, and especially whether it appears professional enough for a grown-up nonprofit. There may be some nonprofits who started out small and use the tools that are free to nonprofits, but then as they grow, they might be afraid that Google tools convey maybe an image that they are not as serious, or maybe still pretty new. They're not using an official suite of tools. So can you talk a little bit about the ways the professional Google Workspace that we recommend and that nonprofits and even some companies are using is different from the free tools that maybe we're all familiar with?
Sure, it is worth just talking about the fact that because Google, I mean, first and foremost, Google is an advertising company, so they make their money by providing a tremendously wonderful and effective search service, free to everyone, and for using it, they track what you search for, keep track of you as the searcher, and throw ads in your way on either in your search results or in other Google. You have a personal Gmail account, and as you're using it, you see these ads for things that you searched for last week, and you're like, that's just crazy. How do they know that I'm interested in getting a new air conditioner or whatever? And it's like, yeah, because you searched for air conditioners and you were logged into Gmail at the same time, and so forth. That's what makes Google the bulk of its money. Google Workspace is somewhat carved out from that. So there's definitely an evolution or an evolutionary path from Gmail to the Workspace Gmail. And, it's the same product more or less, but Workspace Gmail is free of ads. They don't track you in the same way. They're not trying to make money off of you with advertising. It's much more separated and secure. And, it's definitely not part of that other paradigm. It's the same platform essentially. So whatever has been working, whatever they did in terms of designing for their consumer audience, which is much larger, that design carries over into their Workspace, but it's a different thing. And you don't have a gmail.com address. You would have, whatever nonprofit.org address is. So it doesn't come across as I think it's just it's the proof or whatever is in the customers. And I'm just going to go ahead and go to the next slide here. There are a lot of corporate workspace, Google Workspace customers who are clearly, they are there. And we have plenty of nonprofit organizations, some of whom I would consider fairly button up, that are not, hand to mouth nonprofits. Not that we don't love our hand to mouth nonprofits, but that are not hurting for money. They choose Google Workspace. They are very professional. They have very professional and high opinions of the work that they do, and they would not do it if they didn't think it came across that way. And certainly this list of customers right here, and the fact that Google has so many workspace customers, not just small businesses, but large corporations as well, using Google Workspace. So I think it's professional. It's different. And we'll talk about this in a future slide. Probably the biggest headache is some of the calendaring stuff can sometimes get kind of messy when someone sends you an email, someone emails you an invitation from their calendar and Outlook with Microsoft 365 on the back end. It comes to you in your Google Workspace mail, Gmail, essentially. You can accept it. When you accept it, it goes onto your calendar. All that works great. But some of the wrinkles that are pretty seamless if you're on the same platform, like if they cancel, it doesn't automatically go away from your calendar. You have to get another note. It's a little bit less clean.
I've definitely had that happen.
And vice versa. If you're emailing a calendar, it's just a little bit less clean. But I think that's on the side. I don't think it affects, in my opinion, it doesn't seem like it affects people's opinions about whether or not it's professional, because there's just too many people that are doing it. It's well, how can it be unprofessional if all these professional customers are using it? So that's my take on that.
Totally. I'm going to jump in for 2 seconds and just, if you want to go back to the previous slide.
Sure.
We had one question that I think we could answer now, and then I'm going to save, there's a couple more questions coming in, but we have time for questions at the end. So I'm going to try to save them and ask you then.
Sure.
But we did have a question about security. So I was kind of just between this slide and the slide you just showed us of all of the companies that are using it.
Right.
Can you address
speak to security? Sure. I mean, I would say that, and we'll talk about the fact that Microsoft 365, which is really the single point of comparison to Google Workspace, those are the two choices for this stuff, for email, document sharing. Actually, document sharing has a number of other players. Dropbox and Box come to mind, but for email, calendar, those two things especially, it's pretty much Google Workspace. There are other players. I'm not, if someone's chatting, well, what about whatever? Yeah, there are other options, but those are the two.
Security in general.
But in terms of security, compared to Microsoft 365, what Google Workspace doesn't really have is quite the seamless integration in terms of using that platform to also secure your Windows devices, because Google doesn't really mess around with Windows devices. I mean, they have some security features in it, but they don't have that. So with Microsoft 365, you get some additional sort of built into the platform. You get some additional security stuff that has to do with artificial intelligence and stuff like that, and that can be helpful. That said, I would say that Google Workspace is definitely secure enough, and maybe I'll steal something from our CTO and the guy who does all of this sort of security consulting for us, Matt Eshelman, who's done multiple webinars for over this series, and you've probably heard him speak. Any platform can be made insecure, and I think that's more probably the risk is, do you have multi-factor authentication enabled? Are you training your end users on good security practices and having that training reinforced with phishing tests and on all that kind of stuff? And if you're doing those things, Google Workspace is going to be plenty secure. And if you're not doing those things, it doesn't really matter whether your platform is security conscious or not. You're the one creating the holes. And when I say you, I mean your organization, or you as the gatekeeper for IT security at your organization. So I don't think Google Workspace is insecure. It's true that if you have a Windows world, if you're living in a Windows world, there are some advantages to being in Microsoft 365 in terms of security that goes up and down the stack, but Google secures the services that they deliver fine. You would just probably need some other products sliding in there to sort of manage security of devices if you were using Google Workspace, and possibly that other product would be Microsoft 365 and sort of a hybrid thing, which we'll talk about later. Does that make sense to you, Carolyn? And
yeah, no,
by extension to our audience?
A good answer to that question.
Okay, so we'll slip past this slide then, and we'll go to this slide.
Yeah. So I was thinking when we looked at the big the corporations that are using Google, I can't imagine that the platform that they're using is particularly cheap.
Right.
But when we look at the plans and pricing, I know a lot of people are going to look at that as $0 per user per month for the Google Workspace for nonprofits. But is there a catch to that? And can you talk a little bit about, when that you need to move up to some of these higher?
Yeah, there's not a catch per se. Well, the catch, I guess, is that you can see there that third bullet point or check box point or whatever it is, check mark, that it comes with 30 gigabytes of cloud storage per user. And in this day and age, that's not a lot of storage. And we definitely see clients that are struggling to sort of stay in this tier. And we're kind of like saying, hey, you shouldn't think of this tier as the tier you get to stay in. Like, this is kind of the starter tier. So if you're like starting a nonprofit and it's just you and, a partner or two, that tier, especially since when you're starting a nonprofit, you really have to be attentive to costs. You're probably running at a deficit until you get some grants in and get some sort of momentum. And so that can be really attractive. And it's similar to Microsoft 365 in that way as well. Microsoft 365, there are free tiers, but really at some point we're like, hey, you need to spend a little bit of money. The rest of these prices, we would say that for the majority of our clients, the business standard is more than adequate, and it's what we would want you to sort of think of as your tier. There is an add-on that's not on this list that's called Google Identity Premium or something like that. That's $6 per month, and I don't actually have any clients on it, but it provides some features. We don't have any clients on, I should say, but it provides some features that we're interested in terms of that security stuff that we were talking about before. But I think this business standard at $3 per user per month, you can see that you get 2 terabytes of cloud storage per user as compared to 30 gigabytes. So,
that's a big difference.
An order of magnitude difference. Yeah.
We had a question come in from chat. Are these specifically nonprofit?
These are the nonprofit. So this is the nonprofit. This is a website that if you look for Google for nonprofits, this will turn up, and I should have put the URL in here. But this web page turns up, and it's like the compare plans, link, and it will show you this. All of these prices are more or less 75% off, which is more or less what Microsoft does. So it's so interesting how the two competitors are like, meeting sort of the same sort of place. They're not the same prices. I think with Microsoft, you might spend a little bit more, but Microsoft does have, again, their product, their service is a little bit more full featured in terms of up and down the stack, not in terms of email to email, but in terms of like device management and so on. We'll talk about that. So
we have someone in chat also reminding us that if you want to add Google Voice, that's also an additional fee per user.
Yeah, and that's probably not as cheap. And that's the same story with Microsoft. And there it's because, like, at the end of the day, that 9-digit, is it 9 digits? That the telephone number itself, 10-digit number, like just comes with a cost that is like immutable, and so they basically have to pass that cost through. So you can get Google Voice, you can get, a business voice plan from Microsoft. In a lot of ways, these are very comparable platforms. It's interesting in that regard.
All right, so I think we're going to go to a little bit more interaction now. So I'm going to launch the next poll and see how people are feeling about Google. So do we have some evangelists here? So the first choice is Google. I just love it. I use it for everything. We have a second choice, Microsoft has my heart, or at least I'm used to it. Or number 3, not applicable because you didn't make Macs an option, which we do have a previous webinar about managing Macs at an organization level.
You can love Google and Macs, or you can love Microsoft and Macs.
That's true. So we will
They're not mutually exclusive. Let's see what people say.
All right, so let me give people another moment or two to answer their feelings on Google, and then I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Steve, would you mind?
Yeah, I don't mind reading at all. So
About them?
there are 32% of the answers were that they love Google, and then 43% love Microsoft, or at least that's what they're used to, which is a nice caveat to add there, Carolyn, on this poll. So fair enough. It's not necessarily a Microsoft evangelist, but that's what they answered. And then a 25%, or just rounding up to 25%, say that it's not applicable, that neither of those two choices quite works for them.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you for helping us out with that. So we're going to pivot a little bit now to compare the way the two platforms work, how they approach typical tasks, or kind of their philosophy behind where they came from, and how that affects the way the platform works.
Right. So yeah, we already talked a little bit about the pricing and how the pricing is comparable. I think the story on this slide, well, there's a report here that the slide has a link to. And are you going to chat this as well, Carolyn?
Yes. Yep. I'll put that
out. So for those of you listening on the podcast, there's a report that Google, of course, is the one that you download this from a Google Workspace marketing page, and they sponsored the research. I'm sure it was real research, but obviously the intention was to find findings that looked good for Google Workspace compared to Microsoft 365. So take that for what it's worth. But I think that the take-home message is that this would be community IT's perspective as well. Let me just I don't think I have it anywhere else in the slide deck, so I might as well. I wasn't planning to, but let me just give a quick history. There was a period of time, I'm talking about like maybe 2000. Maybe even in the aughts, like 2008, 2009, 2010, I can't remember when it was, but where the precursor to what's now called Microsoft 365 and the precursor to what was now called Google Workspace were first released by these tech giants. And they were sort of, email and SharePoint for Microsoft, but document storage and stuff, and calendaring and all that. And you have your own domain name, and it was kind of replacing all this stuff that was for a lot of places still happened on servers in their offices. And at that point, for the most part, we were probably telling our clients, you should go ahead and just keep a server in your office, because none of these products are really that mature. And it was depending on good internet access, which was not something you could count on at that time. And if the internet was down, then you couldn't get your email and all that kind of stuff that went with that. But if you were going to do it, we really felt like it was a flip of a coin. Like both were good, and they were pretty equally good. And so we had probably half of our clients at that time that were doing this going into what it was called. It wasn't called Workspace, and it wasn't called Google Apps at that point. I don't remember what it was called anymore. But half are going Google and half are going Microsoft. And within 3 to 4 years, it seemed like it was really the ones that had gone with the Google ones had made the wrong choice, because Google, which is an advertising company, really wasn't investing in their platform much. Microsoft, which was a software company, but really has pivoted pretty easily, because its software and services are kind of one's like just an evolution of the other. They're still a customer facing, you pay us for a product, we make the product as best we can. That's their DNA, and they've been investing in in Microsoft 365 or whatever the platform was called over the years, and iterating and making it better and better. And so I would say 3 or 4 years ago, if you asked me which was the best one, there would have been a no-brainer. Microsoft 365 is definitely the way to go. Workspace is a distant second, but somewhere along the way, and as part of it was the rebranding was an effect, not a cause. But the rebranding was part of a signaling that they're getting very serious about it. And they have really invested in Workspace in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years. And it has really caught up. And at this point, they're both pretty good platforms. And we are comfortable with supporting nonprofits who are in either. Some characteristics of Workspace. It's very much browser based and always was. And that's, and Google Chrome is a Google product. They don't need you to use Chrome, especially now that the Edge browser in Windows is basically Chrome with a different skin on top of it. But they are trying, they don't need you to be in Chrome, but they are a browser, like that's where they live. They have their web-based advertising, their web-based search, like everything from Google has always been in the browser. So that's where their services really work. And that makes it very lightweight. It has to be lightweight because it has to deliver over the internet live. So it's quick, it's lightweight, it's easy. Because it's a browser, there is no Windows partiality because a browser can be on a Mac or even a Linux computer. And as long as it has the plugins and stuff, it works fine. The search, hey, what is Google if not a search company? It's wonderful search. So it fits well into a best of breed stack. One thing that's interesting is, and this I think has more to do with the fact that it was a consumer product first than anything else. This bullet point about it being oriented towards the end user. We'll talk more about that when we get into some of the technical weeds about Google Drive and use Google Drive as an example of this. But the consumer was an end user or just a person, and that's where the products were like built for. They really sort of tacked on or added on like the administrative features, the management features, the sort of IT department features, if you will, afterwards, as they were adding to a consumer product to make it into a corporate or enterprise product. And that still, that sort of design evolution still shows through. Yeah, it has a strong presence in schools. So if you're in any kind of education setting, like if you're working with, if you like are a nonprofit that works in the education world, and a lot of the external stakeholders that you work with are teachers, they're going to want to share their curriculum that they write, and their lesson plans are going to probably be in Google Docs, or it could be, and they'll want to share them with you. And obviously, it works great when you're working with other Workspace users. I mean, it works wonderful. So. And there are a lot of other Workspace users out there.
That is totally true. Can you talk a little bit about Microsoft then? Are there
sure?
And
hey, what do you know? We have a slide about that. Yes,
there's a slide coming up right about it. Are there sometimes it's better to use Office 365 or where it does a better job?
Sure. Yeah. So Microsoft is not. Like Microsoft 365 is part of a larger stack for them, right? So who makes Windows? Microsoft does. Who makes the Office desktop suite? Microsoft does. And they also, well, Google also has their Google Cloud, but Microsoft has this whole Azure cloud thing where they put like, the fact that in the old days, Microsoft made all this server software and Microsoft SQL and all that. So they have lots of integrations between them. They are oriented towards the administrator. Their customers, especially in the old days, and so they have a whole sales department, oriented around selling to IT departments. They didn't sell to end users. They didn't convince the end user to use Microsoft 365. They convinced the IT department that Microsoft 365 was what you should use, and then the IT department rolled it out to everyone else. So they're much more oriented towards, administrative control, administrative insight. The fact that if you have a Windows computer, Microsoft 3, you can log if you have a Windows computer that's a modern computer, we would say, hey, you should probably have that computer associated, like joined is the term we would use, joined to Microsoft 365, so that you actually log into the computer with your email address and your Microsoft 365 password. And then your computer knows, oh, that's who this person is. So when you launch Outlook, like it already knows that who this person is. And if Outlook is being paid for with your Microsoft 365 license, it's already activated. And when you launch OneDrive, which is a Microsoft file storage place, like they already know who you are, and it's like, and that makes it seamless and easy. And if suddenly you're logging in from a different location, they can, the Microsoft security part of the stack can alert on that and all that kind of thing. And that's great. So it's, especially if you're a Windows organization and not a Mac organization, but if you're a Windows organization, it can be advantageous to not have to do your own best of breed, but just go with Microsoft and let them do everything for you, because it's built pretty well. It may not be perfect at every layer of the stack, but it's definitely good enough. And the fact that you don't have to build the integrations or worry about those things, it's all done for you by Microsoft, makes it really well. I mean, I think also that's this question that you wrote for me on the slide, Carolyn, is the Office Desktop Suite the killer app, is a good one. Google's document editing, it integrates okay with the Office Desktop Suite. You can save a Word document to your Google Drive, no problem. But, if you save your Word document to a SharePoint site, then you can co-author your Word document with other people at the same time if they have Word, a modern version of Word on their computer. And that can be nice, so there are some advantages that Microsoft has by sort of owning, or at least being a big player in these different layers. But if you don't love Outlook, or if you don't love Windows because you all have Macs, then some of these advantages start to become less important.
I think we're getting some good chat, people sharing like the things that they find advantageous in one or the other. But we had a couple of questions come in that I think you could maybe address right now. One person says that they have users who really prefer Word and Excel. So do you feel like if you just tell them that they have to use the Google equivalents and just practice and start using them, they will eventually come to like them? Or how do you feel about those two?
It's a good question. I mean, I would say partly the answer is no, in the sense that there is no way that Google Docs can match Word, and there's no way that Google Sheets matches Excel on some of the edge or power user functionality. And it depends on kind of what you're doing. I think, for simple text editing, Google Docs is great and fine. Like and they've been improving it in the last 18 months or so. It's more full feature than it used to be, for sure. But the familiarity people have with Word, and it's interesting, if you get younger employees, they'll feel the same way. They'll hate Outlook because they like Gmail because they grew up with that in school, and my son, he's going to college next year. I mentioned he's just graduated, and they've just given him a Microsoft 365 account at the university he's going to. And he's like, this is weird. Like, he hasn't used Microsoft Word his entire life. And now it kind of makes him feel like an adult, like I'm graduating to the adult world. I'm going to start using Microsoft Word. I think particularly it's worth saying that for your finance people, they need Excel. Like, you just have to have Excel for them. But the fact that you can still save those documents to Drive, because you can, it's not really a problem. I think it's more on the problem is more, and maybe the person who asked the question in the chat was alluding to this. What about your culture? And what about like if 75% of your people are happy to use Docs and trying to use Docs all the time, and you have, 25 or less % of your people that just don't want to, but they kind of need they need to collaborate with these other people. And especially if oftentimes the people who are fully committed to the desktop suite are the older people, and because they've been using those products for a long time. And sometimes by being older, you're higher up in the organization's hierarchy, and so it's harder to just tell that person, no, you gotta get with the new way. So I don't have a great solution for that. I think some of that is just gonna have to be hammered out, in the organization, in the culture, the fact that collaboration takes give and take by different people, and finding ways to come up with that. I think I
I
That's
feel
really
like
good.
this is a great segue into our next slide about, do we have a general recommendation?
Right, right,
And that has to do with familiarity as well, but also how much do you, is your organization going to work within the suite of tools, and how
yeah,
much are you going to have to hybrid out?
right, right. Yeah, so I'd say that if I were starting a nonprofit today, and I'm assuming, no, I shouldn't say, if it were me starting a nonprofit, I would probably be using Windows computers because that's who I am. So I'm a Windows computer user, and I would probably say, you know what? Having that Microsoft stack all the way up and down, it's going to be really beneficial in the long run. And I'm going to just go ahead and sort of hitch my wagon to Microsoft's train, or whatever that metaphor is, and run with it, because I know Microsoft's going to be around for, they're not going anywhere. They're going to keep investing in the platform and so forth. If I were on a Mac, if it was a Mac organization, I'd feel a lot less strongly about that, and I could probably be 50-50. Especially if it's a young nonprofit that, doesn't need to be in Word, like Google Docs probably is good enough. In some ways, one of the questions I have, big picture, is like, are documents even going to be around, in the future? Like, there's always going to be information saved on computers, but is it going to be in the form, like, we know we already don't
That you would
print
print out.
documents,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
like, the whole idea of Word, like getting the kerning just right and all that's kind of like gone away anyway. So, maybe Google Docs, like that simple editing, is more than good enough. Like, you can do a whole grant application, send it to the grantor, who can evaluate you and say you want it, and no one may have printed that out the whole time. It's possible.
Yeah, yeah. I think I love how you were talked about it, I think earlier when we were talking about this presentation too, that if you're in the current, you can paddle the other way and use a
Right,
different tool and make it work.
right,
But generally the easiest thing is to stay in the suite and in the
right,
tools that you're in.
right. That's,
So
yeah. I would say if you're already in Google, and you're like, I don't know if this Google works for me, I would say make it work for you, because it's a lot of work to transition. It's a lot of work to transition, and it's probably not worth it. Like, they're close enough that you should be able to live well in either one. Now, there are some caveats to that, like if all of your external stakeholders are in the other platform that you're not in, and that fact that
it's going to be more
collaborating
complicated.
externally, like, that might be easier, but it's a lot of work to change. And we generally tell people that it's not worth changing, that they're both really pretty good.
They're both good. I'm gonna move us along a little bit now. We're gonna do our next poll, which is, we're gonna start talking about how you use shared files, and Steve is gonna give a quick overview of how shared files work in Google. So, and this also goes to, like we were saying, like your organization and your institutional culture.
Mhm.
So if you have an organization that's super organized, maybe even OCD organized and hierarchical, you can go ahead and answer that. Or if your organization is a little bit more relaxed about internal structures and files, you can answer that, or other, don't know, doesn't really apply, or haven't really thought about it. It's just something to think about as you're thinking about the file storage and how hierarchical that is. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll and show it. And yeah, we have a lot of relaxed.
Wow. Yeah. So rounding up, 30% of the respondents said that their organization is super organized and hierarchical. And then 60%, rounding down, are relaxed about their internal structures and files. And then we had 10% who answered not applicable or don't know.
So
It's
this
interesting.
also, there was a question that came in about using Google Docs offline. And I feel like that kind of is a good segue as well into our next topic, which is the shared drive and how that
Right. And that's a good point. I'll just address it, that the Google Docs can be used offline, even though Google Docs are in a browser. There's an extension that you can, add to your Chrome browser or whatever, that allows you to work offline on Google Docs. So yeah, this is now, we're shifting a little bit, and I need to pick up the pace a little bit, I realize. We're shifting now to sort of a specific like case study almost of the Google Workspace world, and I included it in this deck because I think it illustrates some of the differences, or some of the what Google Workspace is and how it sort of operates. So we're going to talk about Google Drive, which is the place that you Google Drive is where you save documents, right? So anything that you use Google Docs for gets saved to your Google Drive, but also that Word document that you edited in Word, if you're a Google Workspace user, you can save it to your Google Drive, and that Google Drive can be synced to your local computer, so you can just save it right into File Explorer or into Finder if you're a Mac user, and it will sync up to Google Drive, which is the same thing as SharePoint OneDrive is for Microsoft 365, same as Dropbox is for Dropbox users, same as Box is for Box users. That's Google Drive. But what makes it kind of interesting is that, originally it was a consumer product. So was Dropbox for that matter. But, because it was sort of browser based, it was very flat. It wasn't really, they weren't really thinking about like having a really strong folder structure. Folders, when you're in a browser, can be an impediment to speed, because every time you click on a folder to open it to see it, your web page has to reload, and if it's on a slow internet connection, which is less and less of an issue, but in the olden days, you might have to wait 2 seconds to see what was in that folder, and it slows things down. So better just to save your files in your drive with no organization at all. Just save them, and when you're trying to see your files, if you're actually trying to scroll through them, it's like thousands of files just all unorganized. But who cares? This is Google. Just search for it, and it will pop up to the top of your list, because their search is so good. Even if you don't use the perfect terms, they kind of know what you want, and they give it to you, and it works great. Similarly, sharing, which you can do in all these platforms, and you can do it in Google Drive, is sort of ad hoc and peer-to-peer. And you just, if you're looking for something that's been shared with you, similarly, you may or may not look for it by navigating a folder hierarchy. You just search for it, and it pops up to the top of your list, and you open it. And who cares, like, who owns the document, as long as you have access to it. And that's kind of the principle of the whole thing. And this is a little bit different from the way that Microsoft, Box, these other things do. That this ownership, this end user focused thing, and it's worth spending some time talking about it. And so we're gonna talk about that a little bit. So just to preview, shared drives are Google's sort of answer to the headache that they've sometimes given to organizations by using the traditional Google Drive, where everything's ad hoc and everything's sort of saved wherever, willy-nilly, wherever they want to. So shared drives, unlike the Google Drive, which is mine and yours, and each person has their own Google Drive, shared drives belong to the team or the department that whoever created it assigns a number of different people to it, and then that shared drive, even though they created it, isn't owned by them. It's owned by the organization, essentially. And if you put something, and if you share that shared drive with 4 people, when they save files to that shared drive or to a subfolder of the shared drive, they are essentially giving ownership of that document. It's not theirs anymore, and they'll be warned. It'll pop up and say, if you save it to this folder, it will no longer be yours. It'll belong to the shared drive. Is that okay with you? And you say, okay, yes, it's okay with me. It's still search still works all great and everything, but by solving this ownership problem, which we'll spend a little bit more time talking about, shared drive sort of solve that. And let me talk about the specifics here a little bit. So in my example here, we're looking at 2 little clips from a screenshot. So this is shared with me, okay? And there's a folder called finance in it. This is a hypothetical, this isn't real, but in my hypothetical example, my boss, I'm in the finance department. And by the way, I'm not a finance person. So we work with lots of nonprofits and I've worked with lots of finance teams in nonprofits. But if my example makes no sense operationally, forgive me, because but I'm assuming that I'm in the finance team. And one of the things that I do on the finance team is keep track of payments to outside contractors. So my boss, the CFO, has created a folder called finance and has shared it with me. So my boss owns this folder, okay? But it's been shared with me. So I see it in the share with me section. And now I'm aware that I've already created a folder called outside contractors that had in it a subfolder called reimbursement receipts. And that was sitting in my drive. And so I'm like, oh, well, this shouldn't be in my drive. This should be in the finance folder that's owned by my boss. So I drag it into the outside, I drag the outside contractors folder into the finance folder, and it warns me, well, anybody that has access to the finance folder. So it's no longer going to just be me and whoever I've shared it with, because my boss hasn't just shared this finance folder with me. I have 3 other colleagues on the finance team, and those 3 other colleagues are now going to be able to see the outside contractors. Well, that makes sense. I'm on board with that. So now this folder is inside finance, and reimbursements receipts is inside outside contractors, and anybody that has access to the finance folder has access to all of this. And I've shared reimbursements receipts, here's a little sharing icon, with the 7 or 8 outside contractors. They don't have access to the other stuff higher up, but they do have access to this reimbursement receipts folder. And I've said, hey, anything that you want me to pay you for, you need to put your whatever it is, your document or your spreadsheet that you need me. So here, someone named Sarah Schoenfeld has put in a document here that has some consulting fees that they want to be paid for, and it's been saved here by them. But this is an outside person. They are still the owner. So the point here is that their ownership gets really crazy. Like, I actually, let's say that Sarah Schoenfeld is no longer working with us or whatever. We're trying to clean this up. And the CFO one day is going down into their into their folder that's theirs, and they see this folder and this folder, they go in and they try to, if they can't delete this because it's Sarah's, they can remove it from this folder, but it's always going to be in Sarah Schoenfeld's drive. It's Sarah Schoenfeld's. You can't get rid of that. And conversely, Sarah Schoenfeld can always delete it from her drive, and if she does, it's going to disappear from my folder, even though I kind of think it's mine now because she put it in there. No, it's hers. She owns that. This can create some problems. We did have an example of a client that the marketing person shared a folder where they invited a bunch of youth to record like 5-minute videos with their iPhones or whatever that was just talking about how helpful or whatever valuable this program had been to them. So they record a video, whatever, I don't know, this after school program, I don't know the details. This after school program changed my life, blah, blah, blah. I love it, whatever. It's a great video. The marketing person, got them to sign a release so that they could, knit these videos into a larger, video that I don't know what the video was for. Obviously you could use it for fundraising, but maybe it was also used as a part of the program deliverables. I don't know. I was helping her like a year later with some other stuff, and she's like, wait, where are my videos? All the releases were still there because she owned the releases, but the videos were gone. And I was like, well, I don't think they weren't your videos. And probably, I just assume, videos take up a lot of space. Those young people needed some space back on their Google Drive. They were using the free version of Google, I'm sure. They were probably 16, 17 years old. So they deleted it and it was gone because it wasn't theirs. If they had been using a shared drive, then if they had shared it, when the young person saved the file into the shared drive, it would have been popped up and said, hey, are you willing to give ownership to this person and to this organization of this file? And they generally, people are not averse to that. They're not really thinking about ownership at all. It's really a kind of a technical concept that doesn't really have anything to do with like real life functionally. But it makes a difference in these specific cases. And it also makes a difference in just like funky things like when someone leaves your organization and it's time for you to close their account. They own all these files. And what do you do about that? Well, Google has a way of transferring ownership, and you can do that, but it has to be transferred to someone else, and those files have to sort of move around. And it would be a lot cleaner. And Microsoft never had this problem. Box never had it. It was kind of a fact of the way Google, and it makes it sound like I'm talking badly about Google. I'm giving an example of where, the evolution of Google's products from sort of being a consumer product does create a challenge, potentially, for administrative control and stuff. The product works well as long as there aren't those things happening that sometimes do happen. So I'm not really trying to slam Google on that, but I do think it's important for all of you who are using Google to make sure that you start using Google Drive, shared drives, because the shared drives, because of the things will come back at some point to potentially cause problems for you. What makes it even more complicated, I'm sorry, do you mind if I run with this, or are we?
Only if you do it quickly, because we're going to run out of time.
Okay. So this last slide here is about if you're trying to, let's say that now I'm going to, instead of using that, having my outside contractors be in a drive that was shared with me, I'm moving it to a shared drive called finance. I drag it in and it says, do you want to change the ownership? It doesn't just say that you're going to change who can see it, but you're changing ownership. And I say, yes, move. Only a super admin can move a folder because of the problem that I'm about to speak to, which is the fact that they know that the ownership of all of those files inside are probably all over the map. They basically don't want to allow, you can, as an end user, regular person, you can move individual files, but folders need to be done by a super admin because of the fact that the stuff inside the folder is almost certainly owned by different people. So they're just trying to stop that from being a problem. And if something in that outside contractors folder is owned by an external person, you can still move it by clicking the move button, but the move won't be perfect. And there will be problems because it can't move. It can't change ownership of external stuff. You as a super admin only have super admin control of your workspace. You don't have control over Sarah Schoenfeld's stuff. That's outside of your workspace. That's an external person. So
when you see that folder after you've moved it, those files are just not in it.
They would still be in the old, there would be duplicate folder structures with most of them being empty, but some of the external stuff still remaining in the non-shared drive side. It'd be a weird thing where like these folders are mostly empty till you get to the bottom and it's like, oh, there's these 3 files in here. Yes, you're exactly right. You have to sort of see it to understand it, but it's just something to be aware of. So going to shared drives if you haven't yet, and be aware that as you get, starting fresh is one thing, but if you try to move old stuff in there, potentially if there's external stuff saved in it, it could be, you have to work around that and figure out how to solve that problem.
Well, someone was asking or mentioning in the chat about clutter in general of like your, the way it always has been. You could create as much as you wanted to, thinking about storage, of course, but I think, so it's just a different way of looking at it. Are you hierarchical and you have these folders that are in the structure and you keep them clean, or are you kind of, we'll find it.
Right. Yeah, I will say that my own take has shifted a little bit. I used to be much more about keeping everything clean and uncluttered and hierarchical and finding things through a folder structure. And as search has just gotten so much better and so fast. And with my email too. I used to put all my email in different folders, and now I just kind of like it's just one inbox and I drag it.
You're going to look for it.
I'm going to search for it and it's going to come up very quickly and it's not going to be a problem. And it's like, that just changed in the last 3 years or so for me.
Yeah.
And it's like,
some people,
and it works.
It's not there yet. I think there was some.
Right. Well, some people use that sorting, not just as a way to like build in the ability to find it in the future, but like it's a way to process. You're thinking about the emails and organizing as you go. And that's fair.
Yeah.
All
Well, I
right,
want
we have
to
to
move
get
us
through this. Yeah,
along. Yep. So we have this, I think, so if you had a question in the Q&A or in the chat, we're probably not going to be able to get to it, but I will be sending out the link with the, to the video when I post that in the podcast and the transcript. So we will put any questions that we didn't get to in the transcript, and Steve will give us an answer on those. So don't worry, but it
sounds
won't
good.
be until next week. So can you combine Google Workspace and Office 365?
Yes, and we do have clients that do. And in fact, as you've already alluded to earlier, that's what next month's webinar, which I'm not doing, but we have a client that is doing a combination. And so Carolyn will be interviewing them and the ITBM who works with them on what it's like to sort of straddle and be in both. I do think you need to, it's not like you should say, well, we have both and you can use both for everything, because then it's like people will have their preference, but you will never know which platform to look. So you definitely want to have like some clarity that, okay, and first of all, email you can't have in both, because the world needs to know where to send the emails to. And so everyone's either in Office 365. I mean, you can have a mailbox, but like in terms of receiving external email, it can only go to one or the other for the most part. You can do forwardings on individual mailboxes, but that gets really tricky very quickly. But like if you say, all right, we're going to use Office 365 for email, and obviously with email, calendaring sort of goes right together because you have to email meeting requests and all that kind of stuff. But we're going to use Google Drive for our documents because we work with so many external stakeholders who are also using Google Drive, and it just works better to be in the same world as them on that. That's like a nice division. So you need to think about that. So it does require good governance and documentation and training so that people know which system to use when. We do have a thing here about ID being a decision point. Most of our clients that are doing this at this point are not trying to do single sign-on. They just have two different set of credentials. But if you want to do single sign-on, you can, but you just got to sort of think about which one's the primary one, and then probably make that one the one that you sign into with. The last thing I'll say is that the thing that we're seeing the most of is that our Windows users, so if you're a Windows-centric organization in terms of the computers that you use, but you have Google for email, Drive, calendaring, all the stuff that was in that list of icons at the early slide. But now you need to think about managing your Windows computers. We would say, hey, probably you should go ahead and especially since for nonprofits it's not expensive, go ahead and sign up for your Office 365 account just to manage the Windows computers. And that speaks to what I was talking about. There's a very nice like split there. We're just using Microsoft 365 to like log into our Windows computers and have some policies on those Windows computers about things like encrypting the hard drives and being able to manage them remotely by like doing a factory reset if we need to, or managing their updates, that kind of stuff. So that's the split that we would see the most commonly.
I got to jump in because we are doing a whole webinar on it next month. So can you go ahead to that?
Oh, yes, I will.
I will
skip ahead. Yes.
Look for that. So we're so excited. We will have Dominic Diggs from the Social Justice School, which is this really cool charter school in DC. And they are doing this. They have Office 365 and Google Workspace, and they have managed to create a hybrid situation at the enterprise level. So we're going to talk about how they did that and what the issues are and how to think about it. So it's not just for schools and education tech. I think if you've got a hybrid situation, this would be a good webinar to come to. It's just a case study. So you can register on our website or look for the email link. Don't think we have time to go back over the learning objectives, but I hope that you did get a chance to kind of learn more about Google Workspace, the different approaches of Google Workspace and Office 365. And thank you, Steve, so much for that deep dive, shallow deep dive into file sharing, because really that could be its own webinar, but you just touched on some of the things to think about and what happens. So for everyone who's stayed with us until now, thank you so much. As you're leaving the webinar, there will be a survey Please help us improve and do the survey. As you leave, it will pop up, and one respondent will get a $25 gift card. We draw the names at random. So I thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Steve. This was super informative. And like I said, I will be sending out a link, and we'll be posting the video and the podcast and the transcript with all of the other links that we talked about and the questions that we didn't get a chance to answer. So again, thank you so much, Steve.
Sure thing. Thank you, everyone.